In Britain, going hungry is a growing problem, so why are so many people turning to food banks? You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. You can't feed the family or yourself at home, so what do? Increasing numbers of people do use food banks. As of 6 months ago, there were more than 2,000 in the UK.
Britain is not usually a country associated with poverty, but the UK has seen an alarming increase in food bank use in recent years. Living costs have risen, and the price of the weekly shop for many households has become too much.
There's over 13 million people living in poverty in the UK. Food bank use is at an all-time high. Britain's largest food bank network, the Trussell Trust, said it distributed over 1 million three-day emergency food supplies to families in crisis last year. In 2012, it was just over 100,000. In a space of 5 years, that's a massive rise.
In northwest London, this food bank has seen an increase in people using their services. When Michael first came here, he hadn't eaten for 2 days, and it was difficult to bring himself to seek help.
My pride kicked in because I've never done it before. I've never used a food bank before, and yeah, I was a bit nervous when I first came. I just think it's the cost of living now. The cost of food now is phenomenal. To go and buy food, it's ridiculous, and a lot of people that use the services are on benefit, and the benefit they get don't cover them to pay for the whole week for food.
At the food bank, they say that poverty in the UK takes different forms.
The face of poverty just looks different in different areas. So for example, there is poverty in Africa, and there's very common image you see of someone experiencing poverty. Whereas in the UK, because it's a more affluent country, people don't seem to recognize it and see it as a problem, but it's just, I would say, invisible. So people don't tend to recognize it when they see it because they're used to a different image of what poverty should look like, meaning someone on the street or someone who, is an orphan. But there could be someone who, has a roof over their head but not the funds to afford food. That's still poverty.
It's not only adults that are suffering from UK austerity and its impacts. Britain, with the 5th largest economy in the world, is seeing growing rates of child poverty. Breakfast clubs in schools were initially set up for parents who drop their children off on their way to work. But in Birmingham, where 42% of children live in poverty, schools in the UK's 2nd largest city are increasingly seeing children turning up just needing to eat.
We have families where they're not able to sort of provide enough food for the children in the mornings or the main meals on the evenings. This is the worst it's been for over a decade.
And sometimes school staff have to step in to help.
Families really needed some help with making sure that they've got enough food at home for themselves and for their children. So we take our families to the local food banks, and we'll make sure that they have, on 2 or 3 occasions, enough sort of foods that they can keep going until additional services or school can do more for them.
Nearly 500,000 of those using food banks last year were children, and with ongoing cuts as part of government austerity plans, there seems to be no end in sight to rising levels of poverty. Is this now the reality of modern-day Britain?
Pleased to say that joining us at the round table for this programme, we have Rajesh Makwana, who helps run Sufra Food Bank, that's in northwest London. Elisabeth Garratt, who's researching what's called food poverty at the Centre for Social Investigation, that's part of the University of Oxford. We have Rennie, a political analyst for Labour Future, and Ben Harris-Quinney, chairman of the Bow Group, that is a conservative think tank. Raj, let me come to you first of all. When people turn up at the food bank, is there a way of generalising their state of mind? Are they desperate? Are they thankful? Both, or what?
A bit of both, to be honest. Obviously, for somebody to come to a food bank, they're experiencing an acute crisis, usually a financial crisis, and they just cannot afford food. Many people don't know that the food bank actually exists until they're referred to one. When they turn up, they're often very anxious, not sure what to expect. Obviously, there are taboos associated with going to a food bank, but inevitably...
A certain amount of shame, do they?
Indeed, a certain amount of shame, but inevitably people are massively relieved when they sit down and they speak to one of our volunteers who asks them about their circumstances, asks them what sort of food they need, and then produces, a few bags of really helpful and much needed food, toiletries and other essentials for them to take away.
And yet, this is not the long-term answer, is it? Because as I understand it, they can come to you for 7 days, and they can only do this 4 times a year. So that's 1 month out of 12, effectively.
Yes, we provide only limited support to people in emergencies. We operate on a referral basis. People don't just walk in off the street. They need to be referred by a registered agency, including the local council, who need to make an assessment that they're in a situation where they need help. And we only provide 4 food parcels a year, and each parcel is designed to last up to 7 days.
But Ben, you're quite critical of some of the reasons why people get themselves in this sort of mess. Do you recognise a need for this kind of help?
No, I wouldn't say I was critical of the reasons why people get
themselves... You say it's because a lot of children are fat, they're eating the wrong food.
No, I don't say that. That's not why people are using food banks. I would say that if you look at the statistics, what you tend to see with people that are in relative poverty are actually quite high rates of obesity and childhood obesity. People that are using food banks, however, I think are a slightly different case.
If you don't disagree with food banks, and I mean they are helping people, why do you think so many people are going hungry in this country?
Well, I think what you've seen, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, is a rise in living costs. And food costs particularly actually have risen well above inflation rates. I think the point you touched on before was really about diet and the kinds of foods people are purchasing. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that people that usually fall into the category of relative poverty are spending too great a proportion of the money that they're spending on food on non-nutritional food. And also, often there is a problem with children and children in poverty, that many are slipping through the cracks, that the schools are not picking up on the fact that they are going hungry, and there is a complex range of reasons at home quite likely as to why they're not getting the correct nutrition. And as I say, that could be for people that are not getting enough food, full stop, or that could go for people that are eating the wrong kinds of food and therefore falling victim to
Elizabeth,
childhood
you've done loads of research on this. Do you want to address some of the points that Ben's made, add your own at this point?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that there's a complex set of reasons, and obviously every person is different, but the real reason that people visit food banks is that they don't have enough money, whether that's because they don't have a job, whether their job doesn't pay them enough, they don't get sufficient hours, or whether they're on benefits. And of course, following the financial crisis, there was a huge change to benefits, but benefits haven't, the amount of money available hasn't kept pace with huge rises in living costs. That's why we're seeing this big gap, that people are going hungry and their children are going hungry.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree broadly with that assessment, although I think the reasons are complex, as I said, and perhaps we can get into some of them. But the problem is, where's the money going to come from? It's all very well saying the government should spend more money on this and more money on that. The government is currently 2.6 trillion in debt. We have a debt to GDP ratio of approximately 90%.
But by any definition, a government that allows its citizens to go hungry is failing, surely.
I would agree with that in the sense that I think the government is spending money on the wrong set of priorities. However, as per a range of austerity measures, the benefits budget did need to come down. It's a huge budget, it's one of the largest budgets. And what I'm arguing for is to avoid a scenario whereby when there is another recession, we're in a similar position to Greece financially before the 2008 economic crisis hit. What we want to avoid is overspending now, so when there is a recession, things collapse and get so bad that you know, a very sizable proportion of the country are going hungry. So government has to make difficult decisions.
So one of the decisions it made, and this was going back a few years, was to get rid of 6 or 7 levels of welfare benefit payments, lump them all together in what's become known as the universal credit, which was probably at a slightly lower rate there by saving some money. But the big problem, everybody seems to say, is that, look, this thing hasn't been handled properly. People aren't getting the money at the time they need it, and that's why they can't get food.
Yes, exactly. And I think you've seen a 1/3 increase of food bank usage where universal credit has been introduced. And I mean, I have to slightly disagree with what's been said. I mean, just on a narrow point, a lot of the reason that people who are in poverty are buying non-nutritional food is non-nutritional food is cheaper. So that's a systemic problem with our food market. That
I'd like to get into that a little bit later, because a bag of tomatoes and some really nice vegetables are a darn sight cheaper than a McDonald's.
Well,
it depends where you live.
Yes, yeah. I mean, but the broader point, I think, is that one, when George Osborne and Nick Clegg came in, and they used this example of Greece when they came in 2010, was they actually spooked the economy. The economy was covering quite well, and actually economic growth nearly went back into recession. And even George Osborne had to recognise that his austerity had gone too far, and he had to pull back from that and soften the austerity measures. So you actually ended up with reducing the deficit.
But universal
by less.
credit, let's talk about, let's get into that, because it's being blamed for everything.
Well, I think universal credit, the principle that Labour supports and Labour Future supports, is a good one, whereas you simplify everything and you provide something that's quite generous, but that tapers off at a good rate, so that people, it makes sense to go into work or to increase your hours, so you improve your personal financial situation and you become less dependent on the state. The problem is that when George Osborne was controlling how that was introduced, it was too miserly, and therefore you're seeing it's actually making the problems worse when it should be actually leading to an improvement of the situation, less use of food banks.
You know, you could boil this down to one question, and I could ask it again and again and again during a programme like that, and that is, why are people in Britain going hungry? Why?
Well, I mean, I think we have to go back to the issue of austerity again, to be honest, because, you know...
There weren't hungry people before that.
Well, people may argue that there are always hungry people, but we do know that with the right policies, we can lift people out of poverty and out of hunger. And it is actually a matter of policy. When it comes to the freeze on benefits, the 4-year freeze on benefits, we do know that will increase the level of hunger and poverty in the UK substantially, and it will push about 500 million people into poverty. Now, I think when, you know, that fair enough, we may need to reduce our outgoings as a nation, but we need to be very careful about how we go about doing that and where we raise money from. And if it is going to result in people being pushed into poverty, we need to draw the line there, because that's just reeks of a sense of an absolute lack of compassion, basically. And I don't think we should be doing that as a nation. I think most people would agree. 5
out of 6 people who go to food banks, some research has shown, are out of work. But more interesting, because I would sort of expect that by and large, but more interesting to me is that 39% are single men. Is that because they, I don't know, anybody got an answer for that?
So when welfare reform was initiated, certain groups were looked after better than others. So, for example, older people were comparatively protected, and the research that I've undertaken, that other researchers working in the area, has all shown that older people don't tend to visit food banks, not just for those reasons, but that is a main one.
There's a shame thing in that as well, isn't there?
That's
Pride,
true.
let's put it that way.
Yes. But with changes to welfare, it has often been working age single people, particularly men, who have really borne the brunt of that, which is perhaps why we're seeing them at food banks in sort of disproportionate numbers.
Ben, you wanted to jump in, but let me ask you something first of all. We have Raj saying benefits freeze, which simply means people have got less money, and yet you're advocating that they probably get even less money because we need more austerity.
Well, first of all, on the question of austerity, it's a funny kind of austerity that borrows 200 billion more than it takes in at the Exchequer. That's not austerity. If you were applying that to your household income, and you were £2 million in debt, and you called
Okay,
austerity
okay, so,
living £200,000 before
You want more austerity.
Well,
He says austerity's causing it.
my point is we never had austerity. Under George Osborne's leadership and David Cameron's leadership and the period that Theresa May has been in government, the national debt has doubled. So the question I would ask is, when is it going to be paid down and who's going to do it? And in terms of your question on compassion, what is more compassionate? Is it compassionate to spend money we don't have now? Or is it compassionate to realise that by doing so, you will create an inevitable crisis in the future that will mean far more people will suffer?
Exactly.
Yeah,
it's compassionate to make sure that people
but it's
do
nothing. It's nothing compared to the crisis that will occur if there is another recession. I mean, I'm talking about a crisis whereby cash points would stop working, power stations would shut down, this country would completely grind to a halt.
And I think it would be for people to go hungry now?
I don't think it's ever okay for people to go hungry. What I'm saying is the government isn't making the right decision, but has a very difficult decision to make between what it spends money on. And I think what George Osborne was doing was not pulling back because he thought that austerity would do damage.
He choked off the recovery, though. He did choke off the recovery, and he had to pull back himself.
I think George Osborne pulled back for the same reason that Tony Blair pulled back, which they realised they could artificially inflate the economy by debt and then get out before the roof came.
Let's get back to the central point here, which is that people are going hungry. And I want to read you a little something from a vicar in northwest London. He writes for The Guardian, a column called Loose Cannon. You may well be aware of it. And he tells this story about a respectable, as he put it, middle-aged woman who came to his vicarage door and said, I had to talk to you because I was about to go and shoplift food from Tesco. And he was able to give her a parcel from the back of the church, and she said, thank you so much. And he said, this is his point, there are those who would characterise coming to see him or going to a food bank as work housing, the old workhouse. That is deliberately making life so intolerable for poor people that they are forced into doing absolutely anything to keep themselves off the streets. This is 2018, isn't it?
It does strike, it's amazing how many people walk in and you think, how can this person be in this situation? You know, they're educated, they were once financially very stable, but just because something's happened in their lives, it's pushed them over the edge and into poverty. It may be that there's been a bereavement of the breadwinner in the family, for example. It may be that they've lost the job or they've experienced a bout of depression. These things can happen to any one of us sitting around this table right now. So, you know, we have to just be aware that these things are affecting ordinary people increasingly, and that's not right. Something should be in place. There should be a safety net in place to make sure that people do not have to turn to food banks. As much as, you know, I love working where we work and the services that we provide are very diverse and brilliant, but we ultimately shouldn't have to be there. We're providing services that ultimately the local government and central government should together be able to provide.
Elisabeth, sorry, let me ask you, are people malnourished, which is very different, or are they simply hungry?
Well, it's quite difficult to ascertain whether someone's malnourished. That's something that happens over a period of time. Some people who visit food banks are maybe seeing an acute financial crisis that passes very quickly. Others might be experiencing more long-term problems. We have had research published in the British Medical Journal, the sort of main medical journal in this country, has had doctors writing in that journal saying that they are concerned about levels of malnutrition, the number of people being admitted to hospital. Part of that could come back to what Ben says, is that people are eating the wrong foods. They probably are, but I think it's important to remember that cheap food is generally not very nutritious, and that's why people with lower incomes and from more disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to be obese. It's not that they're sitting there eating all day, it's that they're buying cheap food, maybe convenient food, because they perhaps work 2 jobs, or they have, they don't have a nice kitchen to prepare their food in. I think saying that someone who is obese clearly can't be hungry, we know is not the case.
Ben, you wanted to jump in, but let me ask you this. There's a suggestion that 1 in 4 parents in this country have gone without a meal because they want to be able to feed their children and they otherwise can't. I personally find that quite hard to believe. What's your take on it?
I don't find it hard to believe because, as
1
I
in
say,
4, 25%.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps those numbers are a bit high. I've seen figures that would suggest approximately 8 million people, which is not quite as high as that. But as has been said, we've seen a significant rise in cost of living, pretty much across the board in the UK, but particularly in relation to food. So I don't think it is particularly surprising that people are finding themselves at crisis point at various junctures. My point is that the government is not making the decisions it is making out of malice. It is making the decisions it is making because it doesn't have the resources to do any more. And frankly, it doesn't have the resources to even do what it's doing at the moment.
Okay,
which is why you're seeing
what should
NHS
it
prices.
do? What should it do to stop people going hungry?
Well, I think you could immediately cut a lot of government departments. I would completely abolish the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, the Department for International Aid. I would completely cut our international aid budget down to nothing until we can ensure that we can provide for our own citizens at home.
But the only way you
UK.
can provide for your own citizens if you have more money to spend is by increasing the amount of money they have, i.e. welfare benefits, and you don't want to see that.
I think you can look at increasing the budgets for education, to give children better meals at schools. I think a lot of the reasons why parents go hungry is to provide that food for their children. And I do think there is a real issue around nutrition. And Jack Munro, I think it was, wrote a book, a recipe book for people in poverty to be able to cook nutritious meals on a very low budget. And I don't think there is, frankly, enough education in schools as to how important nutrition is. And
trouble is...
Could I just
yes,
jump
please,
in and
please.
say that research undertaken in Canada, where food banks have existed for a lot longer, has found that there's no evidence that people can't cook. The research that I've been involved with in Manchester, people described how they would go to the supermarket before closing time to get the reduced food. They would cook using the microwave rather than the oven to save money. People knew what they were doing. It wasn't that they were ignorant, it's that they didn't have enough money.
yes, but I mean, we clearly have a major problem. We are, I believe, the top nation in Europe for obesity. We're one of the worst nations in the world for rates of obesity. So clearly there's a problem, and clearly people are making the wrong choices in terms of their nutrition.
Ben, we're sort of running out of time a little bit. And you wanted to chime in there.
I think those issues are related to the problems in the way our food market works specifically.
But that's long term, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think that's the source of it, because you asked the question, why are people going hungry? And it goes way back to the economic model we use. See, I think what the Bow Group argues for is a very laissez-faire free market approach.
That's not what the Bow Group argues for. We're not a free market, we're a conservative think tank.
Well, okay, well then, with respect, and I think maybe this is something that the Bow Group can come on board with, is actually having a much more Keynesian approach to our economic approach, a much more investment-based economic approach, and looking at rebalancing our economy as a whole. We're far too dependent on the city. We come off much worse when there's an economic crash. Now, it's good that we have the global financial capital in the world. That's a strength, but we've become over-dependent on it, and we do need to look at the systematic underlying economic issues.
Yeah, but we're talking food specifically, not the broader picture. And I have to ask you to stay to that subject.
Sure.
He's proposing long-term ways of solving the problem, but that's not going to help some child who's hungry this weekend.
Well, so I disagree in the sense that I think we should do more now to help with these specific crises that we're talking about. But I think fundamentally we do need to have a conversation about longer term how we raise our trend rate of economic growth so there is more funds available to put into our welfare system, to put into investing in our economy. So we're in a kind of, we're stuck at a very low trend rate of growth, and that means a lack of resources to do what we need to do. But as you say, I mean, this is a problem in Canada, in America, and across Western Europe. It's not just us, but there are specific areas where it's worse for us.
I'm going to have to move it on to Raj, because you were nodding at a couple of points that were made there.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say earlier that I think we need to get real. We are living in, one of the richest countries in the world, and this idea that we need to cut everything down to its bare bones and not be able to provide for people who really need access to basic essential services and goods, I think is a misnomer. I think we really need to get away from thinking that way. There are other ways of ensuring that money can be redistributed and our resources are shared more equitably across the nation, as you're alluding to yourself there, Ed. So I think we need to just be very careful about how we frame this whole debate.
Well,
I've got to bring it back to Liz because we're getting towards the end, and you have had a fair shout, Ben. What would you like to say to wrap up the conversation?
I suppose maybe going back to your point saying, there just isn't enough money in the pot to allow the welfare benefits to be set high enough. I think it's very important to look at the big picture and see that if people aren't getting the nutrition they need, they're ending up in hospital or in A&E, or they're needing more social care. And so if this is a problem that we can solve before it reaches a crisis, the government will save money elsewhere. So I think it's a bit short-sighted to say we can't afford welfare now while we're paying for it later.
Okay. Ben, quickly.
Well, I would say very briefly that the economic reality is that we have a lot of debt-fueled wealth in this country, which isn't real, which is sort of the point you were making. So you say we're the 5th wealthiest country in the world. I think if there was a recession like 2008 again, we would very quickly find ourselves without the core natural resources that would make us able to survive.
So many questions. A few answers. I think, thank you very much indeed for coming and joining us on this edition of Roundtable. In terms of the cost to the country, I asked you about malnutrition a little bit earlier on, Elisabeth, and according to one study, it is 12 billion a year in terms of malnutrition cost to the NHS. Personally, I find it quite appalling that in this day and age, people are arguing about things that seem so inconsequential in terms of the bigger picture, and there are those out on our streets now, those we might see when we next walk to the shops, who are going hungry, and there doesn't seem to be an awful lot that people are doing about it. I'm David Foster, you've been watching Roundtable. Thank you to all of my guests, and thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.